Okay, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at Stave 4 of A Christmas Carol, The Last of the Spirits. As always, I'll read through the extract before going through key quotations and annotations. And again, I would just remind you there's no reason to be writing down all of these. If you want to, if you have time to, then that's fine. Otherwise, just focus on those annotations that are in bold. And remember, the purpose of these videos is to help you with the classwork that's also being set for you. Okay. The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. When it came near him, Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for in the very air through which this spirit moved it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment, which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible save one outstretched hand. But for this it would have been difficult to detach its figure from the night, and separate it from the darkness by which it was surrounded. He felt that it was tall and stately when it came beside him, and that its mysterious presence filled him with solemn dread. He knew no more, for the spirit neither spoke nor moved. "I am in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come," said Scrooge. The spirit answered not, but pointed onward with its hand. "You are about to show me shadows of the things that have not happened, but will happen in the time before us," Scrooge pursued. "Is that so, spirit?" The upper portion of the garment was contracted for an instant in its folds, as if the spirit had inclined its head, and that was the only answer he received. Although well used to ghostly company by this time, Scrooge feared the silent shape so much that his legs trembled beneath him, and he found that he could scarcely stand when he prepared to follow it. The spirit paused a moment, as observing his condition and giving him time to recover. But Scrooge was all the worse for this. It thrilled him with a vague, uncertain horror to know that behind the dusky shroud there were ghostly eyes intently fixed upon him, while he, though he stretched his own to the utmost, could see nothing but a spectral hand and one great heap of black. "Ghost of the future," he exclaimed, "I fear you more than any spectre I have seen, but as I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear you company, and do it with a thankful heart. Will you not speak to me?" It gave him no reply. The hand was pointed straight before them. "Lead on," said Scrooge, "lead on. The night is waning fast, and it is precious time to me, I know. Lead on, spirit." The phantom moved away as it had come towards him. Scrooge followed in the shadow of its dress, which bore him up, he thought, and carried him along. They scarcely seemed to enter the city, for the city rather seemed to spring up about them and encompass them of its own act. But there they were, in the heart of it, on 'Change, amongst the merchants, who hurried up and down and chinked the money in their pockets and conversed in groups and looked at their watches and trifled thoughtfully with their great gold seals and so forth, as Scrooge had seen them often. The spirit stopped beside one little knot of business men. Observing that the hand was pointed to them, Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk. "No," said a great fat man with a monstrous chin, "I don't know much about it either way. I only know he's dead." "When did he die?" inquired another. "Last night, I believe." "Why, what was the matter with him?" asked a third, taking a vast quantity of snuff out of a very large snuff-box. "I thought he'd never die." "God knows," said the first with a yawn. "What has he done with his money?" asked a red-faced gentleman with a pendulous excrescence on the end of his nose that shook like the gills of a turkey-cock. "I haven't heard," said the man with the large chin, yawning again. "Left it to his company, perhaps? He hasn't left it to me, that's all I know." This pleasantry was received with a general laugh. "It's likely to be a very cheap funeral," said the same speaker, "for upon my life I don't know of anybody to go to it. Suppose we make up a party and volunteer?" "I don't mind going if a lunch is provided," observed the gentleman with the excrescence on his nose, "but I must be fed if I make one." Another laugh. "Well, I am the most disinterested among you after all," said the first speaker, "for I never wear black gloves and I never eat lunch, but I'll offer to go if anybody else will. When I come to think of it, I'm not at all sure that I wasn't his most particular friend, for we used to stop and speak whenever we met. Bye-bye." Speakers and listeners strolled away and mixed with other groups. Scrooge knew the men and looked towards the spirit for an explanation. The phantom glided on into a street. Its finger pointed to two persons meeting. Scrooge listened again, thinking that the explanation might lie here. He knew these men also perfectly. They were men of business, very wealthy and of great importance. He had always made a point of standing well in their esteem, in a business point of view, that is, strictly in a business point of view. "How are you?" said one. "How are you?" returned the other. "Well," said the first, Old Scratch has got his own at last, hey? So I am told, returned the second. Cold, isn't it? Seasonable for Christmas time. You're not a skater, I suppose? No, something else to think of. Good morning. Not another word. That was their meeting, their conversation, and their parting. Scrooge was at first inclined to be surprised that the spirit could attach importance to conversations apparently so trivial, but feeling assured that they must have some hidden purpose, he set himself to consider what it was likely to be. They could scarcely be supposed to have any bearing on the death of Jacob, his old partner, for that was past, and this ghost's province was the future. Nor could he think of any one immediately connected with himself to whom he could apply them, but nothing doubting that to whomsoever they applied they had some latent moral for his own improvement, he resolved to treasure up every word he heard and everything he saw, and especially to observe the shadow of himself when it appeared, for he had an expectation that the conduct of his future self would give him the clue he missed, and would render the solution of these riddles easy. He looked about in that very place for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to his usual time of day for being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes that poured in through the porch. It gave him little surprise, however, for he had been revolving in his mind a change of life, and thought and hoped he saw his newborn resolutions carried out in this. Okay, so quite an intriguing start to this stave then. Now, obviously, what Scrooge hasn't realised is that in all of these conversations, the person who's being discussed, the dead man who's being talked about by all of these people, is in fact himself. He's walking around listening to all these conversations, and the irony is, while we as readers can probably put two and two together and work out who's being spoken of, Scrooge himself is oblivious to this, and he's simply struck by the apparently ordinary, dull nature of these conversations. So let's have a look through and let's see how these people and these scenes are presented and what we can learn here about Scrooge's developing character. So the first thing that's obviously going to be of note is the appearance of the final spirit, and it's quite different. It really is in stark contrast to the other ghosts which have appeared so far. Let's have a look at this first line then. It's shrouded in a deep black garment. Now a shroud is a cloth that is used to wrap a corpse, and in its appearance wearing this long black robe, it almost seems like a personification of death itself. So the ghost of Christmas yet to come is forbidding and sinister in its appearance. Dickens portrays it as a deathly figure like the Grim Reaper, and as such it serves to reinforce the moral lesson that Scrooge is being taught. Unless he changes his ways, the future that awaits him will be a frightening one. So it's a ghost which is surrounded by secrecy. Its head, its face, its body, none of this is visible. So unlike the other ghosts, which have been, even though they're sort of strange in their own ways, quite human, this third and final ghost, fourth if you count Marley's ghost, this final spirit seems really quite sinister, quite disturbing and quite unhuman. Naturally, Scrooge is terrified when he sees it. So unlike the previous ghosts who were essentially quite sympathetic towards Scrooge, the final ghost fills Scrooge with dread. Its silence makes it seem less human than the others and more unsettling. So while the other ghosts spoke to Scrooge, they were able to have a conversation, he was able to sort of form a kind of relationship with each of them, this ghost remains completely silent and in that way is portrayed almost as more threatening, more sinister, more menacing, and Scrooge is naturally afraid. So they have a conversation and Scrooge asks him, "You're going to show me things which are yet to pass, the things that are in my future," and the ghost slightly nods. Again, Scrooge is shown to be very, very afraid. And this fear is understandable, isn't it? We can empathise with it. At this point in the novel, we've seen Scrooge's past, Scrooge's present. We've seen him make some progress on his moral journey. We've seen him start to become a better man. So we have some sympathy for him. We empathise with him here and we share his fear. We also are led to realise just how determined Scrooge is to change his ways. Despite his fear, he knows that the ghost is there to teach him something and he follows the ghost. So even though his legs are trembling beneath him, he does follow. Again, Dickens emphasises how dark this ghost appears. It's simply one great heap of black. And just think about that again in contrast with the other ghosts. The previous ghosts bore symbols of light, so the ghost of Christmas past shines light from its head, and the ghost of Christmas present carries a torch. But this ghost is aligned with darkness. Now, if you think back to those previous sources of light, we've discussed the fact that they symbolise hope, they symbolise positivity, and therefore the kind of potential for better things in the future. But now the lack of light suggests that unless Scrooge changes his ways, there is nothing positive that awaits him. There is only death. Now, here Scrooge explains for the first time very clearly and openly his hopes to become a better person. He says, "I fear you more than any spectre I have seen, but as I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I'm prepared to bear you company and do it with a thankful heart." I think this is really, really important because this is the first time he's openly stated his desire to become a better man. He understands that he'll learn from this ghost, and although he fears the lesson, he is appreciative. He says he'll do it with a thankful heart. And I think back to the Scrooge that we met in Stave 2, who, when the first of the three spirits appears, the ghost of Christmas past, Scrooge thinks to himself that he would have had a better night's sleep if the ghost hadn't been coming, and that would have really benefited him more. But now he completely acknowledges he must change for the better, and he's quite happy, although he is afraid of what the ghost has to show him. Okay, so we're introduced now to quite an immoral kind of scene. We're brought to the sort of banking centre of the town, or amongst the merchants, so this sort of hub of dealing and negotiation. And the setting immediately suggests immorality. The merchants share Scrooge's obsessions with work. Note how they look at their watches as if they're constantly keeping an eye on the time, and they're also obsessed with the acquisition of wealth, as Scrooge was. And this is symbolised as they chink the money in their pockets, so they're constantly feeling the coins that they carry about them, and the way that they toy with their great gold seals, these symbols of their financial power. So all of these individuals represent the kind of people that Scrooge used to mingle with, and we see Scrooge looking towards his usual space in this area, so as though he's normally part and parcel of this scene. So these are sort of future Jacob Marleys, if you like. These are the kinds of people that Scrooge saw right at the beginning of the novel, having been reduced to those sort of pitiful ghosts flying around and carrying the chains that represent their sins. These are the kind of people that Scrooge used to associate with. He was one of them. Now, these men are discussing the death of someone else that they used to know, and we see in this conversation just how little respect, admiration, or fondness they had for this person, whoever he was. So Scrooge is oblivious towards the fact that they are in fact discussing him. And I think this is a really, really meaningful scene. It's really powerful because the men are discussing Scrooge's death in front of him, although they can't see or hear him, and he is unaware of it. They have no emotional reaction to the news. So none of them seem sad, none of them are in mourning, none of them are grieving. In fact, they actually seem bored by it. One of them says, "I thought he'd never die," and the other yawns. So they seem quite bored by what they're talking about. And their interest only lies in knowing what Scrooge has done with his money. They say, "What has he done with his money?" And one of them says, "I only know he hasn't left it to me." So Dickens here reinforces the idea that for years Scrooge has been prioritising gaining money over maintaining friendships, over having positive relationships with other people. And now in death, he's only valued for his wealth. These people care nothing for Scrooge himself. It's purely noteworthy in financial terms. What's happened to his money? Where's that gone? I wonder who's taken care of that. So they're only really interested in what they could stand potentially to benefit from his death. Even when they talk about going to the funeral, one of the men notes that it's likely to be very cheap because he doesn't think anyone will go to it. And another man says he doesn't mind going to the funeral as long as he gets a free lunch out of it. So again, these people consider going to the funeral not as a mark of respect, but purely because it's a way to get a free lunch. Again, they're greedy, they're obsessed with wealth, just as Scrooge was. And note how that description of a very cheap funeral with no mourners echoes the description of Marley's lonely funeral in Stave 1, and doesn't it just emphasise the idea that Scrooge is headed for the same fate if he doesn't change his ways? Unmourned, unloved, unremembered. So they continue walking through, they sort of watch the speakers and they watch these men breaking off and going to talk to other people, and they carry on down this street. Again, the ghost points out two other people meeting. And again, they have a really short, almost insignificant conversation about the death of this man. One of them says, "Old Scratch has got his own at last, hey?" And the other says, "Yeah, so I'm told. Cold, isn't it?" So immediately just changes the tone of the conversation, as though the death of this man is meaningless. So Scrooge at first is surprised that these conversations are what the ghost has brought him to listen to, because they seem to him to be trivial, that is, ordinary, everyday, unimportant. And the irony there is really that Scrooge doesn't know he's the one being spoken about. The conversations seem ordinary to him. And if he were to realise that it was himself being spoken about so callously, so cruelly, so heartlessly, he'd be distraught. As it is, he doesn't understand the significance yet, and he's spending his time trying to work out how this relates to him. However, we see that Scrooge again is making these little steps of progress towards becoming a better person, because despite not understanding what he sees, he's determined to treasure up every word. He hopes to understand the lesson he believes that the ghosts are there to teach him, and what these words could tell him. So he no longer has any doubts about the worth of the ghost's visits. He's desperate to learn how to become a better man. He is headed, albeit slowly, towards redemption. So he's constantly now looking out for how he can apply what he learns to his own life, how he can benefit from what he's being shown by the ghosts. So even these meaningless little conversations, he's trying to remember every single detail. As he looks around, he thinks that it would be nice to see himself. He thinks that if he can see his future self somewhere, that's how he's going to learn the most about how he can change. But as he looks around, there's another man standing in his place where he would normally stand. But this gives him little surprise. He says he had been revolving in his mind a change of life. So he's been thinking all the time about how his future hopefully will have changed for the better. So he hopes that the fact that he can't see himself amongst the other merchants means that he's stepped away from that kind of life, that he's changed course. He's currently ignorant of the truth of what the future holds for him. Alright, so in our next scene we learn a little bit more about how this dead man was perceived, and we learn more about the people who remember him after he's gone. I hope that that's been useful, and I hope that you will join us next time for some more analysis of Stave 4.